The business party was a lively, buzzing affair, with chatter and clinking glasses filling the elegant room. I remember standing with my friends, feeling excited by the atmosphere, and enjoying the attention as we laughed and joked. It was one of those events where everything felt perfect, at least for me. I'd been drinking, my inhibitions lowered, and the energy of the crowd was contagious. Brian, my husband, stood apart from the group, hovering at the edge of the room. He wasn't someone who thrived in social situations like this. He preferred quieter moments, more intimate gatherings. But I was too caught up in the moment, I didn't notice at first. But as we stood in our small circle, the conversation took a casual, playful turn. Someone made a snide comment about men who were whipped, controlled by their wives. Without thinking, I joined in. I laughed, and I laughed loudly. Then, in a split second, the second I made a cruel joke about Brian, my husband, in front of everyone, I realized what I'd done. I can still hear the echo of my words hanging in the air, and I remember how they seemed to fill the space and take on a life of their own. At the time, I didn't even realize what I'd done. My friends erupted into laughter, and their amusement fed my own. I felt a sense of smugness and a desire for attention. It felt good in that moment to be the center of the fun, the one with the sharp wit. But as I look back, I can still picture Brian standing there. His face was slightly turned away from the group, his expression distant and hurt. His shoulders were slumped, but I didn't see it then. I didn't see the way the joke and laughter had hurt him. Then came the moment that changed everything. I remember Brian walking toward me, and the air in the room seemed to shift. His steps were slow and deliberate, but there was something different in the way he moved. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as he approached. I tried to smile at him, expecting him to brush off the joke like he always did, but his face remained calm and collected. It wasn't until he got closer that I saw the storm in his eyes, a pain so deep that it made my stomach twist. He didn't make a scene or shout or come and have a word with me in private. Instead, he leaned in close and whispered, "It's over." Then he turned and walked away. Those two words hit me harder than anything I'd ever felt. It was as if the ground beneath me had disappeared. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. My throat felt tight, and the room seemed distant and distorted. The laughter that had filled the space just moments before faded into a muffled roar. I wanted to run after him to call out and take back everything I had said, but I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed by the weight of what I had done. I stood there, surrounded by Grace Lee. My friends were still laughing, completely unaware that my world had just ended. I'd never imagined that a few careless words could ruin everything, but there I was at a business party that had suddenly turned into the worst night of my life. Brian was gone, and with Brian gone, I was left alone with my thoughts, replaying the moment over and over again. I could see the exact instant I had lost him. The moment I let my need for attention and validation outweigh the love I had for my husband. How had I become this person? I'm the kind of person who would mock the man she once loved more than anything. It wasn't always like this. I wasn't always like this. Part 2, How We Met Before That Night. There was a time when I was someone else. I used to be the kind of person who would never have dreamed of hurting Brian. I was the kind of person who valued every moment with him. Our relationship had begun in such a simple way, almost cliché, yet it felt like the beginning of something profound. I met him at a cafe on a rainy afternoon. I was running late as usual, juggling my coffee, my bag, and my phone. In my hurry, I remember spilling the coffee all over myself. I was standing there, embarrassed and flustered, trying to clean up the mess when Brian appeared. He wasn't dramatic or flashy about it. He simply handed me a napkin with a soft smile and offered to help. There was something so gentle and calm about him that it instantly put me at ease. I remember thinking how different he was from the kind of guys I usually went for. He wasn't loud or overly confident, but there was a quiet strength to him that was the start of something special. Our first date was nothing extravagant. We went for a walk in the park, talking for hours. There was no grand gesture, no fireworks, but it was simple, but perfect. He listened and I felt seen for who I was, not who I should be. As we spent more time together, I fell for him hard. We shared everything, our dreams, our fears, our hopes for the future. Brian had this quiet ambition. He wasn't in a rush to conquer the world, but he had dreams of starting his own business, something small that would give him the freedom to live on his own terms. I admired him for that, for his patience and his steady determination. He was so different from me in that way. I was always that he had a quiet ambition. He wasn't in a rush to conquer the world, but he had dreams of starting his own business, something small that would give him the freedom to live on his own terms. I admired him for that, for his patience and his steady determination. He was so different from me in that way. Brian was always happy to take his time while I was always rushing to the next thing. I still remember the moment I knew I loved him. It wasn't a big romantic event. It was on a rainy day, just like the one we first met. We had planned to go out, but the weather prevailing. We stayed in and ordered takeout, then spent the day watching old movies on the couch. At one point, I looked over at him sitting there with his goofy smile, completely at ease. I realized that this was happiness, not the rush of excitement or the thrill of new love, but the quiet, steady contentment of being with someone you love, someone who made you feel safe and understood. We got married a year later. It wasn't a big wedding, just close friends and family, but it was perfect. I still remember looking into his eyes as we said our vows, promising to love and support each other through everything life would throw at us in that moment. I truly believed that we would build a future together, but somewhere along the way, things changed. Maybe it was me, maybe it was both of us. As time went on, life became more complicated. Brian's business struggled to take off and we began to feel the strain. Meanwhile, I was climbing the corporate ladder, working longer hours and attending more and more events. I became obsessed with success, validation, and the rush of being important. In the process, I lost sight of Brian. He remained the same kind, patient and supportive person he had been when we first met, but I wasn't the same person I had been when we got married. I became sharper, more critical, and always on the defensive. I was always pushing for more money, more success, more recognition. And now I've lost the one thing that mattered most in my relentless pursuit of success. I began to view Brian as less ambitious, less driven, less of a man. It's painful to admit that now because it makes me feel monstrous, but it's the truth. I started to look down on him and resent his calm, steady demeanor, which I had once admired. It was that very steadiness that had drawn me to him in the first place. But as I became more focused on achieving more and climbing higher, I wanted him to change and be more like me. I wanted him to be ruthless and aggressive. I wanted Brian to be willing to chase after success at any cost, but that was never who he was. Instead of accepting him as he was, I began to criticize him. At first, it was just small remarks and suggestions that he wasn't doing enough or that he needed to step up. Over time, those comments became more and more sharp and biting. My comments became more sarcastic and eventually I found myself openly mocking him, even in front of others. I don't know exactly when things escalated to that point, but looking back, I wonder if it was some sort of defense mechanism. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself and to my friends, or to the world. I wanted to be seen as powerful, successful, and strong. At some point, I convinced myself that belittling Brian made me look that way, but it didn't. It just made me cruel. Now, all I have are memories of the person I used to be, the woman who loved Brian for who he truly was, not for who I wanted him to become, someone I hardly recognize, someone who can't take back the words that destroyed everything we had. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment things shifted from admiration to resentment. I've thought about it a lot, trying to figure out why it happened. I went from admiring him to tearing him down. It was a slow process, almost imperceptible at first. I didn't wake up one day and decide to bully my husband. It crept in like poison, seeping into the cracks of our relationship. It started with my own insecurities, though I didn't realize it at the time. My career was also a factor. I was doing really well, and I was becoming the person I had always dreamed of being, successful, confident, and respected. I was earning more than Brian and climbing the ladder faster than I ever imagined. People noticed me, they admired me, and they envied me. I thrived on that attention and that validation, but with each step I took towards more swing, as I started to enjoy more and more success, I began to notice something else. Brian stayed the same. He was happy with his small business and didn't care about impressing anyone or about the superficial measures of success that consumed me at first. I told myself I admired his patience and quiet determination, but as time went on, I started to feel differently about Brian. I began to question why he wasn't more like me. Why wasn't he pushing harder? Why wasn't he as hungry for success? That's when I started to compare myself to other business leaders at events I attended. I was surrounded by powerful men, CEOs, and executives who were ambitious, ruthless, and driven. They talked about million-dollar deals, expansion, growth. They were magnetic, and I began to wonder why Brian wasn't like them. Why wasn't he the man everyone envied? It wasn't fair to him. I see that now, but at the time, I couldn't help feeling like his lack of ambition was a reflection of my own inadequacies. The first time I made a snide remark, it was almost accidental. I was at a dinner party with friends when someone asked about Brian's business. I jumped in before he could respond, making a joke about how he loved taking his time. Everyone laughed, including Brian, but I noticed a slight falter in his smile. It was a small jab, but it gave me a sense of power by putting him down. I lifted myself up, and I didn't realize it then, but it became a pattern. I started making offhand comments in front of friends. I was chipping away at him piece by piece, and every time I did, I felt that same rush of superiority. Brian wasn't the type of man to fight back. He'd laugh it off and make a joke about it. I started making comments in front of friends about how relaxed Brian was with his business and how he wasn't in any rush to grow it. I made it seem like it was all in good fun, but I knew exactly what I was doing. I was slowly but surely chipping away at him. Brian wasn't the type of man to fight back. He wouldn't call me out in front of others. He'd just laugh it off and make a joke about it. I made a joke to put him off, and the conversation moved on, but behind closed doors, I could see the change in him. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't laugh as easily and didn't meet my eyes as often. I told myself he was just stressed and busy with work, but I knew the truth. I was pushing him away, and he was letting me. The worst part is that even when I saw the hurt in his eyes and even when I noticed him pulling away, I didn't stop. Instead, I doubled down. The truth is it wasn't just about Brian. It was about me too. I was scared that I wasn't enough, that my success wasn't enough. No matter how high I climbed, it couldn't fill the emptiness inside me, so I took it out on him. Brian became the target of all my frustrations, my insecurities, my fear. If I could make him look smaller, maybe I would feel bigger. If I could point out his flaws, maybe no one would notice mine. It was twisted logic, but at the time, it made sense. It made me feel better, at least temporarily, so I became more ruthless with my words. I openly criticized him, not just in private, but in front of others. There were countless moments when I questioned his decisions. I would confront him, telling him he wasn't doing enough. I told him he needed to step up and be a man. I also criticized his work ethic. I implied he was lazy and indifferent to our future. The first time I said those words, and I'll never forget his expression, he just stared at me, his face full of disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what I was saying. For a second, I almost retracted my words and thought about apologizing, but instead I hardened my resolve. I convinced myself that he needed to hear it and that I was helping him by forcing him to confront his shortcomings. I rationalized it as tough love, believing I was pushing him to be better, but deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I could see it every time he would draw a little more, every time the light in his eyes dimmed just a fraction more. I knew I was hurting him, but I kept going because somehow it made me feel powerful. I convinced myself I was in control, but in reality, I was far from it. I was spiraling and I was dragging Brian down with me. Looking back, it's clear how toxic I had become. I let my own insecurities and fears shape me into someone I wasn't. I barely recognized myself. I had become someone who needed to tear others down to feel better about myself. I couldn't appreciate the quiet, steady love that Brian had always given me. The worst part was that I didn't even realize how much damage I had done until it was too late. By the time I understood the weight of my words and saw how far I had pushed him away, it was already too late. I had lost him and it was entirely my fault. I always thought Brian was unbreakable. I was wrong. No matter what I said or how many cutting remarks I made, he would stay the same, calm, composed, and forgiving. But everyone has their limits and I didn't see his until I had crossed it. Bit by bit, I chipped away at him. I didn't realize that eventually there would be nothing left. I pushed him to his breaking point. When he finally broke, it shattered both of us. It wasn't some dramatic event like a party or something. It was a screaming fight. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, just another day. The two of us were sitting across from each other at the dinner table. There was a thick silence between us. We had grown accustomed to it over the months or maybe even years of barely speaking to one another. I don't even remember what we were eating. What I do remember is coming home, exhausted and irritated after a long day at work where people made me feel important. Brian had cooked dinner like he often did. But instead of thanking him, I made some careless comment about how he must have too much time on his hands. He didn't respond. He never did anymore. He just stared down at his plate, pushing food around with his fork. The silence was unbearable. So I did what I always did. I made another sarcastic remark. Something about how maybe if he spent less time cooking and more time focusing on his business, things would be different. The words themselves are a blur, but I remember the tone sharp and biting, delivered as if it were a joke. We both knew it wasn't, but this time he didn't laugh it off. He didn't try to make a self-deprecating joke or change the subject. Instead, he quietly sat down, put down his fork and looked up at me. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. I had expected anger. I had expected him to snap, yell, or finally tell me to stop. But what I saw was resignation. He said in a quiet, calm voice that he couldn't do it anymore. I'd never heard words like that spoken in such a calm, deliberate way. There was a finality in his tone that chilled me. I asked him in a sharper tone than I'd intended what he meant. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in what felt like, in his eyes, I saw everything. The exhaustion, the hurt, the years of holding on to something that had long been slipping away. He gestured between us. I can't keep pretending everything's okay. It's not. It hasn't been for a long time. I felt a flicker of panic inside me, but I kept it to myself. I told myself this was just another one of our fights, that he'd calm down and things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew this wasn't true. It's just another argument, Brian. I tried to brush it off and regain control. We're just going through a rough patch like everyone does. He shook his head slowly. This isn't a rough patch, CLA. It's something else. I don't know how to fix it. I opened my mouth to argue, defend myself or say anything that might make it stop, but he cut me off. You've been pushing me away for years and I've let you. I kept thinking things. I thought things would improve if you came back to me and we found a way to make it work. But every time I tried, you shut me down. You made me feel small and I don't think I can take it anymore. I was stunned. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. I always thought that if things ever got really bad, we'd fight, yell, scream, and then fix it. But there was no anger in his voice. It was just exhaustion and defeat. You don't mean that, I said. My voice faltered. We can fix this. We just need time. Time, he interrupted, shaking his head. We've had time, years of it, and look where we are. Panic surged through me, but I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to take back all the hurtful things I'd said over the years. Brian, I'm sorry. I blurted out the words, feeling foreign and unfamiliar. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just frustrated, but we can work through this, can't we? He looked at me for a long time. I thought for a moment he might say yes, but then he shook his head. His eyes filled with a sadness I'd never seen before. I don't think I have anything left to give. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't know what to say. All the power I thought I had in our relationship, all the control I'd fought so hard to maintain, it slipped away in that moment. I love you, Claire, he said softly, but love isn't enough anymore, not when it's so one-sided. I wanted to scream, cry, or beg him to stay, but I couldn't. I had spent so long pretending I didn't need him and that I was stronger without him. Now, when I needed him most, I didn't know how to ask for forgiveness. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate as if every step was final. He said he'd stay at his brother's for a while. I think we both need some space, he said. With that, he walked away and the door closed behind him with a quiet click. I was left alone in the silence of our home. The house felt too big and too empty without him. I sat there staring at the empty chair where he had been, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. I had pushed him too far for too long, and now he was gone. The worst part was that I couldn't blame him. I had done this. I had driven him away with my cruelty, my need to control, and my fear of vulnerability. I had thought I was strong and independent, but now, sitting alone in that empty house, I realized just how fragile I really was. Brian had been the best part of me, and now I had lost him forever.